The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Grace Vaughn as her horse collapsed beneath her. The animal's labored breathing telling her what she already knew. They had pushed too far without water. She stumbled away from the dying creature, her canteen empty for the past 6 hours, her lips cracked and bleeding, her vision swimming with spots that might have been buzzards or just her mind playing cruel tricks. The map she had been following, purchased from a snake oil salesman in Tucson 3 days prior, had led her absolutely nowhere. And now she was going to die out here in the Arizona territory, miles from anywhere. Her dreams of starting fresh in California nothing but dust. She walked because stopping meant dying faster. Her feet dragged through sand and scrub, her fine Boston traveling dress torn and filthy, the parasol she had started with long since abandoned. The year was 1882, and Grace had left everything behind. A suffocating engagement to a banker twice her age, a mother who cared more about social standing than her daughter's happiness, and a city that had never felt like home. She was 23 years old and had thought herself so brave, so capable of reinventing herself in the West. Now she realized she had been a fool. The landscape wavered before her eyes. Saguaro cacti stretched toward the cloudless sky like accusing fingers. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard water, but that had to be a mirage. Everything was a mirage now. Her legs gave out and she fell to her knees, the hot sand burning through her skirts. She tried to stand, failed, and felt tears she could not spare sliding down her cheeks. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. Grace looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw a rider approaching. He was real. She could tell by the way dust kicked up behind his horse, by the solid sound of the animal's gait. She tried to call out, but her voice came as barely a whisper. The rider drew closer, and she could make out details now. A tall man on a paint horse, wearing a dark hat and clothes that looked worn but well kept. He spotted her and spurred his mount faster. "Jesus Christ," the man said, swinging down from his saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He was beside her in an instant, pulling a canteen from his belt. "Easy now, easy, just a little at first." He supported her head with one hand, bringing the canteen to her lips with the other. The water was warm but tasted like salvation. Grace drank greedily until he pulled it away. "Not too fast, you will make yourself sick." His voice was deep with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" Grace tried to answer, but her throat was still too dry. He let her have another small sip of water. "My horse," she finally managed. "Back there," he collapsed. The man's jaw tightened. "How long you been without water?" "Hours. Maybe 6, 7, I lost count." He muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse or a prayer. "Can you ride? My ranch is about an hour from here." "You need shade and more water than I have in this canteen." "I can try," Grace said, though she was not certain it was true. The man helped her stand, and she swayed against him. He was solid as oak, and she could feel the strength in his arms as he steadied her. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and eyes that were an unusual shade of green, like new leaves in spring. "I am Xander Oakes," he said. "My ranch is the 00 north of here. Grace Vaughn. I was trying to get to California." California. He said it like it was another planet. "Well, Miss Vaughn, right now we are going to focus on getting you to civilization before you become a permanent resident of this particular patch of desert." He lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. Grace had never been so close to a man who was not family, and under other circumstances she might have been scandalized. As it was, she was simply grateful to be alive. She sagged back against his chest, and he wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her while holding the reins with the other. "Just hold on," Xander said. "I have got you." The ride to the 00 Ranch was a blur of heat and exhaustion. Grace drifted in and out of awareness, conscious only of the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of the man behind her. At some point, she felt him adjust his grip, heard him speaking to her in low, soothing tones, though she could not make out the words. When she finally opened her eyes again, they were passing beneath a wooden gate with 00 burned into the crossbeam. The ranch house was low and sprawling, built of adobe and wood, with a wide porch that promised shade. There were several outbuildings scattered around, a barn, a bunkhouse, what looked like a smokehouse. Grace saw a few ranch hands pause in their work to stare as Xander rode up to the main house. "Lewis," Xander called to one of the men, "take care of Cisco for me. And send someone back to where I found Miss Vaughn here. Her horse is down, needs to be put out of its misery if it is not dead already." A young Mexican man nodded and came to take the paint horse's reins. Xander dismounted and lifted Grace down as if she weighed nothing. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so," Grace said, though her legs felt like rubber. He kept an arm around her waist anyway, guiding her up the porch steps and through the front door. The interior of the house was dim and blessedly cool, with thick adobe walls that kept out the worst of the heat. Xander led her to a bedroom off the main hall and helped her sit on the bed. "You need to get out of those clothes," he said, and Grace felt her face flush despite her exhaustion. He must have seen her expression because he added quickly, "I will have my housekeeper, Maria, help you. She can bring you something lighter to wear. Those Eastern clothes are going to kill you out here." He left and returned a moment later with an older Mexican woman who took one look at Grace and began clucking her tongue in a mixture of Spanish and English. Maria shooed Xander out of the room and helped Grace out of her layers of petticoats and corset, leaving her in just a thin shift. The relief was immediate. "You poor thing," Maria said, her English heavily accented but clear. "Out in the desert like that, you could have died." "I know," Grace whispered. "I was such a fool." "Well, you are safe now. Mr. Xander, he is a good man. He will take care of you." Maria brought a basin of cool water and a cloth and began gently washing Grace's face and arms, removing days' worth of dust and grime. "You rest now. I will bring you some broth, something gentle for your stomach." Grace wanted to protest that she was fine, but the soft bed beneath her and the cool cloth on her skin were too much to resist. She lay back against the pillows, and sleep claimed her almost instantly. When she woke, the light coming through the window was softer, the aggressive heat of midday giving way to evening. Grace sat up slowly, taking stock of herself. Her headache had faded to a dull throb, and her mouth no longer felt like sandpaper. Someone, Maria probably, had left a simple cotton dress draped over a chair and a pitcher of water on the bedside table. Grace poured herself a glass and drank deeply, marveling at how something so simple could feel so wonderful. She changed into the dress, which was a bit loose but infinitely more comfortable than her traveling clothes had been. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a woman she barely recognized. Sunburned, her dark blonde hair tangled, her blue eyes huge in her thin face. She did her best to make herself presentable, braiding her hair and pinching her cheeks to bring some color to them. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Xander in the main room, sitting at a large wooden table and going over some papers. He looked up when he heard her and immediately stood. "Miss Vaughn, you are looking better. How do you feel?" "Much improved, thank you. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your help, Mr. Oakes." "Xander," he corrected. "And you are welcome. Anyone would have done the same." Grace was not sure that was true. She had heard stories of people in the West who would rob a person rather than help them, but she did not say so. "Sit down," Xander said, pulling out a chair for her. "Maria left some stew warming. You need to eat." He served her himself, ladling thick beef stew into a bowl and setting it before her along with fresh bread. Grace's stomach growled audibly, and she felt her face heat with embarrassment. Xander just smiled. "Eat," he said simply. Grace did, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She forced herself to eat slowly, remembering Xander's warning about making herself sick. Between bites, she studied him. He had removed his hat, and she could see his face clearly now. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and sun-bronzed skin. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, a thin white line that suggested an old injury. His hands, wrapped around his own bowl of stew, were calloused and strong, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. "So," Xander said after a while, "California." Grace set down her spoon. "Yes. I was going to start over there, find work, maybe as a teacher or a seamstress. I did not have much of a plan beyond leaving Boston. Boston is a long way from here." "That was rather the point." Grace took a breath. "I was engaged to be married to a man my mother chose. He was 53 years old and had already buried 2 wives. I did not want to be the third." Xander's expression darkened. "So you ran?" "So I ran," Grace confirmed. "I took the money my father left me, the money my mother did not know about, and I bought a train ticket west. I thought I could make it to California, start fresh where no one knew me. But I ran out of money in Tucson, and a man there sold me a map that he said would get me to a town called Agua Caliente in California where I could find work. Obviously, the map was useless." "Agua Caliente." Xander shook his head. "That town exists, Miss Vaughn, but it is still in California, a good 150 miles west of here. And the route that man sent you on would never have gotten you there. You would have died in the desert." Grace felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the room. "He knew that, did not he? He took my money knowing I would die, probably. There are plenty of men like that out here, preying on people who do not know better. I am sorry you met one of them." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Grace asked, "Where exactly is here?" "You are about 15 miles south of a town called Pierce, Arizona Territory. Agua Caliente, the one here in Arizona, is about 30 miles southwest, but it is not much of a town. Pierce is bigger, has more amenities. I go there once a month for supplies." "And your ranch?" "I have been running the 00 for 5 years now. Bought it from the previous owner with money I saved from working cattle drives. It is not much, but it is mine. I run about 300 head of cattle and have 4 hands who help me work the place." Grace heard the pride in his voice and understood it. In a land where so much was harsh and unforgiving, carving out something of your own was no small feat. "What will you do now?" Xander asked. "You cannot make it to California on your own, especially not without money or a horse." It was the question Grace had been avoiding thinking about. "I do not know," she admitted. "I suppose I could try to find work in Pierce, earn enough money to continue on." "Pierce is a mining town," Xander said carefully. "The kind of work available for women there is limited and not always respectable." Grace understood what he was not saying. "I see. You are welcome to stay here for a while," Xander said, "at least until you figure out what you want to do. Maria could use help around the house, and I could pay you wages. It would not be much, but it would be honest work and a safe place to stay." Grace looked at him, trying to gauge his intentions. She had been raised to be suspicious of men who offered help with no apparent strings attached. But when she looked into Xander's green eyes, she saw only sincerity and a kind of quiet compassion. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You do not know me." I know you were brave enough to leave everything you knew behind to try to build a better life. I know you are a long way from home with no one to help you, and I know what it is like to be lost." He paused. "My parents died when I was 16, cholera. I had 2 younger sisters to take care of, and I did not know how I was going to do it. A rancher named Tom Morrison took us all in, gave me work, taught me everything I know about running cattle. He did not have to do that. He did it because it was the right thing to do. I figure I owe it to his memory to help someone else when I can." "What happened to your sisters?" Grace asked softly. "They are grown now. Sarah married a shopkeeper in Tombstone, and Emma married a rancher up near Prescott. They both have families of their own. I do not see them as much as I would like, but we write letters." Grace made her decision. "I would like to stay if you are sure it is not an imposition, just until I can earn enough to move on." "It is settled then. You can have that bedroom you were in. Maria will show you what needs doing around the house. Fair warning, she is a hard taskmaster." Grace smiled, her first real smile in days. "I am not afraid of hard work." Over the next few weeks, Grace settled into life at the Double O Ranch. She woke before dawn each morning to help Maria prepare breakfast for Xander and the ranch hands. After the men went out to work, she and Maria would tackle the seemingly endless list of household chores: laundry, cleaning, mending, preserving food, tending the kitchen garden. The work was hard and physical, nothing like her life in Boston where servants had done all the manual labor. But Grace found she liked it. There was something satisfying about the tangible results of her efforts, about falling into bed each night exhausted, but knowing she had accomplished something real. Maria was indeed a hard taskmaster, but she was also patient and kind, teaching Grace skills she had never needed before: how to make tortillas from scratch, how to preserve meat in the smokehouse, how to get stubborn stains out of work clothes, how to know when bread dough had risen enough. In the evenings, Grace would sometimes sit on the porch with Maria and help her with mending while the older woman told stories about her life, about her husband who had died 10 years before, about her grown children who lived in Mexico. Xander was gone most days, out working the ranch with his men. But at dinner each evening, he would sit with Grace and Maria and tell them about his day, about the calf that had been born, about the fence that needed mending in the north pasture, about the coyote they had chased away from the herd. Grace found herself looking forward to these dinners, to the sound of Xander's voice and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She was also learning about the reality of ranch life. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after her arrival, she was hanging laundry when she heard shouting from the direction of the barn. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding. She found Xander and 2 of his hands struggling to control a horse that had gotten tangled in barbed wire. The animal was panicking, thrashing against the restraints, blood streaming from cuts on its legs and flanks. Xander was trying to calm it while one of the hands, a young man named Billy, attempted to cut the wire away. "Easy, girl, easy," Xander said in a low, soothing voice. "We are going to get you free." Grace watched, frozen, as they worked. It took nearly 20 minutes, but finally they got the horse free and into a stall where Xander could examine the injuries. "Nothing too deep," he said, relief evident in his voice. "She will be okay, but it is going to take time to heal." He looked up and saw Grace standing in the doorway. "Sorry you had to see that." "Is this normal?" Grace asked. "Normal enough. Ranching is not always pretty. Animals get hurt, sometimes they die. It is part of the life." Grace nodded slowly. She had been romanticizing ranch life in her head, she realized, turning it into something picturesque and simple. The reality was much harder, much more raw. That evening, she brought Xander coffee on the porch where he sat watching the sunset. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "Is the horse going to be all right?" Grace asked, sitting down in the chair next to him. "I think so. I cleaned the wounds and wrapped them. Now we just wait and hope infection does not set in." He took a sip of coffee. "Thank you for this. You are welcome." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About California. About whether I actually want to go there anymore." Xander looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What brought this on?" "I left Boston to escape something I did not want, but I am not sure I was running toward anything, if that makes sense. California was just a destination, a place far away. I did not really think about what I would do when I got there or what kind of life I would have. And now I am wondering if maybe I do not need to keep running, if maybe what I was looking for might be closer than I thought." Xander held her gaze for a long moment, and Grace felt something shift between them, some invisible line being crossed. Then he looked away, out at the desert that was turning gold and purple in the dying light. "You are welcome to stay as long as you like," he said quietly. "I want you to know that, even if it is permanent." The words were out before Grace could stop them, bold and a little reckless. "Even then," Xander said, and when he looked at her again, his eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. They did not speak of it again that night, but something had changed. Grace felt it in the way Xander's gaze would linger on her during dinner, in the way her heart would speed up when she heard his footsteps on the porch. She had thought she was done with romance, that her failed engagement had soured her on the whole idea. But this felt different. This felt like something real and solid, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than social expectations and family pressure. A few days later, Xander asked if she would like to ride out with him to check on the cattle in the eastern pasture. Grace agreed eagerly, glad for the chance to see more of the ranch. Xander saddled 2 horses, a gentle mare named Daisy for Grace and his paint gelding Cisco for himself. "You do ride, do not you?" Xander asked, suddenly looking concerned. "I do, though it has been a while. I used to ride in the park in Boston when I was younger." Xander looked skeptical but helped her mount. To her relief, muscle memory took over, and she settled easily into the saddle. They rode out together, side by side, and Grace felt a sense of freedom she had not experienced since arriving in Arizona. The land stretched out around them in all directions, vast and open under an endless sky. "It is beautiful out here," Grace said. "It is," Xander agreed. "It can be harsh, but there is a beauty to it. I never get tired of this view." They rode for about an hour before reaching the eastern pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. Xander dismounted and walked among them, checking each animal with a practiced eye. Grace watched him work, noting the gentle way he handled even the most skittish cows, the confidence in his movements. "Everything looks good here," Xander said when he returned to where Grace waited with the horses. "We can head back." He paused, looking at her. "Unless you would like to see more. There is a nice spot about a mile from here, a spring with some cottonwood trees. Good place to rest before we ride back." "I would like that," Grace said. The spring was everything Xander had promised. A small pool of clear water fed by an underground source, surrounded by a grove of cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade. The sound of water trickling over rocks was peaceful, and Grace could see why Xander liked this spot. They let the horses drink while they sat in the shade, passing a canteen of water back and forth. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said after a while. "Sure." "Why have you never married? A man like you with your own land, I would think you would have had plenty of opportunities." Xander was quiet for a moment. "I guess I never found the right person. When I was younger, I was too busy trying to keep my sisters and me alive to think about courting. Then I was saving money to buy this place. And once I had the ranch, I was too busy running it. The women I met in Pierce were either already married or looking for something I could not give them. What did they want? Safety, I suppose. Security. A life that did not involve the constant uncertainty of ranching. I cannot promise that everything will always be easy or that I will always be able to provide for a family without struggle. Ranching is unpredictable. One bad winter can wipe out everything. But you love it, Grace said. I do. This land, this life, it is in my blood now. I could not imagine doing anything else. He looked at her. What about you? You said you were engaged, but you never talk about him. Grace made a face. There is not much to say. Charles Thornton was a banker, very wealthy, very respectable. My mother was thrilled when he proposed. I think she was more excited about the engagement than I was. Did you care for him at all? No. I tried to convince myself I did, but the truth is he frightened me a little. He was cold, controlling. He wanted a wife who would be seen and not heard, someone to display at parties and bear his children and never have an opinion of her own. I realized that if I married him, I would spend the rest of my life being suffocated. So you ran, Xander said. So I ran, Grace confirmed. And I do not regret it, even though I nearly died in the desert. Even one day of freedom was worth it. Xander reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since the day he found her, and Grace felt a spark run through her at the contact. You will never have to go back to that life, he said. I will make sure of it. Grace looked into his eyes and saw the promise there, the fierce protectiveness. Xander, she said softly. He leaned toward her, and she met him halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then it deepened, becoming something more urgent. Grace wrapped her arms around his neck, and he pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that for weeks, he admitted. Why did you wait so long? Grace asked. I did not want to push you. You have been through a lot, and I did not want you to feel like you owed me anything. Grace pulled back slightly so she could look at him properly. I do not feel that way. What I feel is entirely my own choice. And what do you feel? Grace took a breath. I feel like I have spent my whole life waiting to meet you. I feel like I was supposed to get lost in that desert so you could find me. I feel like maybe everything that happened was leading me here to this moment. Xander kissed her again, softer this time, full of tenderness. I love you, Grace Vaughn. I know it is fast, and I know we have not known each other long, but I do. I love you, and I want you to stay here forever, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. I love you too, and yes, I will marry you. They stayed by the spring for another hour, talking and kissing and making plans for their future. When they finally rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grace felt like she was living in a dream, the good kind that you never wanted to end. Maria was waiting on the porch when they arrived, and one look at their faces told her everything. She let out a whoop of joy and pulled Grace into a fierce hug. I knew it, she said, tears streaming down her face. I knew from the day you arrived that you were meant to be here. Mr. Xander has been alone for too long. He needs someone to love, someone to build a life with. Over the next few weeks, preparations for the wedding began. Grace had no family to invite, but Xander sent letters to his sisters, both of whom wrote back with enthusiastic congratulations and promises to attend. They decided to have the ceremony at the ranch, with the local minister from Pierce officiating. Grace wore a simple white dress that Maria helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair that Xander picked himself. His sisters arrived 2 days before the wedding, and Grace liked them immediately. Sarah was warm and maternal, already mother to 3 children with another on the way. Emma was more reserved but had a quick wit and a kind heart. They accepted Grace without reservation, clearly just happy to see their brother in love. The wedding took place on a beautiful October morning in 1882, with the whole ranch gathered to witness it. Xander's ranch hands cleaned up and put on their best clothes, and Maria cooked enough food to feed an army. Grace had never been to a wedding where she felt so completely welcomed, so entirely at home. When the minister asked if she took Xander to be her husband, Grace did not hesitate. "I do," she said clearly, looking into Xander's green eyes and seeing her whole future there. "I do," Xander echoed when it was his turn, and then he was kissing her and everyone was cheering, and Grace knew she had finally found the place where she belonged. Their wedding night was spent in the house that was now Grace's home. Xander carried her over the threshold, making her laugh, and then they were alone together, husband and wife. He was gentle with her, patient, and Grace was grateful for his care. She had been nervous, her mother's warnings about marital duties echoing in her head, but with Xander it felt natural, right? They moved together in the darkness, learning each other's bodies, and afterward Grace lay in his arms feeling more content than she ever had in her life. "Thank you," Xander murmured against her hair. "For what? For getting lost. For letting me find you. For giving me this." Grace smiled. "Thank you for making sure I would never be lost again." Life as a rancher's wife was different from anything Grace had imagined for herself, but she loved it. She learned to can vegetables and fruit for the winter, to make soap and candles, to tend chickens and collect eggs. She learned to shoot a rifle, something Xander insisted on teaching her in case she ever needed to defend herself while he was out working the ranch. She learned to treat minor injuries and illnesses, becoming the person the ranch hands came to when they had a cut that needed stitching or a fever that would not break. Most importantly, she learned that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. The woman who had left Boston had been timid, uncertain, willing to let others dictate her life. The woman she was becoming was confident and capable, someone who could handle whatever challenges this harsh land threw at her. The first year of their marriage passed quickly. Grace learned the rhythms of ranch life. The spring when calves were born and the land turned green. The summer with its oppressive heat and the constant work of keeping the cattle watered. The fall roundup when they separated out the cattle to be sold. And the winter when everything slowed down and they could finally rest. She also learned about the dangers that came with this life. One evening in their first spring together, Xander came home with a bullet wound in his arm. Grace's heart nearly stopped when she saw the blood soaking through his shirt. "It is not as bad as it looks," he said, though his face was pale. "What happened?" Grace demanded, already gathering clean cloth and whiskey to clean the wound. "Rustlers. We caught them trying to make off with some of our cattle. There was a fight. I got winged, but they got away." He winced as Grace began cleaning the wound. "We will have to keep better watch from now on." Grace finished bandaging his arm, her hands shaking slightly. "You could have been killed, but I was not." Xander pulled her close with his good arm. "I am fine, Grace. This is part of the life out here, you know that." She did know it, but that did not make it any easier. That night, she held him tighter than usual, acutely aware of how fragile life could be. But there were joys too, many of them. The first time Grace successfully made bread that Xander declared was even better than Maria's. The night they sat on the porch during a rare summer rain, watching the lightning dance across the sky. The morning Xander brought her to see the newborn foal in the barn, all long legs and big eyes, and let her name it. In the spring of 1884, Grace realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure, then another before finally telling Maria her suspicions. The older woman's face lit up with joy. "A baby," Maria said, pulling Grace into a hug. "Oh, this is wonderful news. Have you told Mr. Xander?" "Not yet. I want to be certain first." But the signs were all there. The morning sickness that had her running for the chamber pot, the exhaustion that hit her in the afternoons, the tenderness in her breasts. Grace was going to have a baby. She told Xander that evening after dinner, unable to wait any longer. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset as they often did, when she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is someone in here who wants to meet you," she said softly. It took Xander a moment to understand, and when he did, his face transformed. "You are with child?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "Yes. The baby should come in late autumn, I think." Xander pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes. "I love you so much," he said. "Both of you." The pregnancy was harder than Grace had anticipated. The summer heat made her sick and dizzy, and she had to give up many of her usual chores. Maria took over most of the heavy work, with help from Sarah, who came to stay for a few weeks in August. Xander hovered anxiously, constantly asking if she was all right, if she needed anything, driving Grace to distraction with his worry even as she loved him for it. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him one evening when he had asked for the third time that hour if she needed more water. "I know, but you are so small. What if something goes wrong?" "Nothing is going to go wrong. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." But privately, Grace shared some of his worry. She had heard too many stories of women who died in childbirth, of babies who did not survive. All she could do was hope and pray that everything would be all right. In late November, as the weather finally cooled, Grace's labor began. Maria sent one of the ranch hands racing to Pierce to fetch the midwife, an older woman named Mrs. Henley, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Xander was beside himself with worry, pacing the main room while Maria and Mrs. Henley attended to Grace in the bedroom. The labor lasted 12 hours, 12 hours of pain that Grace had not been prepared for despite Maria's warnings. But when she finally heard her baby's first cry, all of that was forgotten. Mrs. Henley placed a squirming, red-faced infant in Grace's arms. "A boy," the midwife announced. "A healthy boy." Grace looked down at her son in wonder. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. She counted his fingers and toes, marveling at how small and perfect they were. "Can I come in?" Xander's voice came from the doorway, anxious and hopeful. "Come meet your son," Grace said. Xander crossed the room in 3 strides and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the baby with an expression of absolute awe. "He is so small," he said. "He will grow. Here, hold him." Grace placed the baby in Xander's arms, and her heart melted at the sight of her strong, capable husband cradling their tiny son with such tenderness. "What should we name him?" Xander asked. They had discussed names but had never settled on one. Grace looked at her son, at Xander's face full of love, and suddenly she knew. "Thomas," she said. "After the man who helped you when you needed it most. Tom." Xander's eyes filled with tears. "Tom," he repeated. "Thomas Oakes, that is perfect." They spent the next hour just looking at their son, watching him sleep, marveling at the miracle of him. Finally, Mrs. Henley shooed Xander out so Grace could rest, and he went reluctantly, promising to be just outside if she needed him. Grace lay in bed with Tom sleeping in the cradle Xander had built, and thought about the path that had led her here. If someone had told her 3 years ago that she would be lying in a ranch house in Arizona Territory, married to a cowboy and mother to his child, she would have thought them mad. But now she could not imagine any other life. The next few years passed in a blur of sleepless nights and baby milestones. Tom grew from an infant into a toddler, learning to walk and talk and getting into everything. Grace divided her time between caring for him and helping run the ranch, which was thriving under Xander's management. They had expanded the herd to 500 head and hired 2 more ranch hands to help with the increased workload. In the spring of 1887, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. She gave birth in August to a daughter they named Rose, after Xander's mother. Rose had Grace's blonde hair and Xander's green eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Tom, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit by her cradle for hours, talking to her in his toddler babble, bringing her toys and rocks and anything else he thought she might like. Watching her children together, Grace felt her heart might burst from happiness. But life was not without its challenges. The summer of 1888 brought a drought that lasted 3 months. The grass turned brown and died, and the cattle began to suffer. Xander spent long days hauling water from the spring to keep the herd alive, coming home exhausted and worried. Grace watched their savings dwindle as they bought feed to supplement what little grazing was available, and she lay awake at night worrying about what would happen if the drought continued. But the rains finally came in September, and the land slowly began to recover. They had lost some cattle, but not as many as some of their neighbors. They would survive, and that was what mattered. In 1890, Grace gave birth to their 3rd child, another boy they named Samuel. Sam was a colicky baby who cried constantly for the first 3 months of his life, leaving Grace exhausted and frazzled. Xander took over more of the household duties, caring for Tom and Rose while Grace dealt with the baby, and Grace loved him even more for his willingness to help. One evening, after Sam had finally fallen asleep and the older children were in bed, Grace found Xander on the porch. She sat beside him, leaning against his shoulder. "You remember the day we met?" she asked. "Every detail. You were half dead in the desert, stubborn as hell even then." Grace laughed. "I was terrified. I thought I was going to die out there, and then you appeared like something out of a dream. I almost did not ride out that way. I was going to check the north fence instead, but something made me change my mind." Tom Morrison used to say that things happen for a reason, that there is a plan even when we cannot see it. I never really believed him until that day. "I am glad you changed your mind," Grace said softly. Xander turned to look at her, and even after years of marriage, the love in his eyes still made her breath catch. "I have never regretted a single moment since I found you, not one. You have made my life fuller than I ever thought possible." "You saved me," Grace said. "In every way a person can be saved. I was so lost before I met you, Xander, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. I did not know who I was or what I wanted. You helped me figure that out." "You saved me too," Xander said. "I did not even know I was lonely until you arrived. This ranch was just a place where I worked. You made it a home. You made it mean something." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind rustling through the grass. This was home, Grace thought. This land, this man, this life they had built together. She had been lost, and he had found her. And in finding her, he had given her everything she had never known she wanted. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Tom grew into a serious boy who loved helping his father work the ranch. He learned to ride almost before he could walk, and by the age of 8, he could rope a calf nearly as well as any of the ranch hands. Rose was creative and imaginative, always making up stories and putting on shows for the family. She loved helping Grace in the kitchen and had a natural talent for cooking. Sam was the wild one, always getting into mischief, coming home covered in mud and bringing home every stray animal he found. In 1893, another daughter arrived, Catherine, who everyone called Kate. She was a quiet baby, content to watch the world around her with solemn eyes. With 4 children, the house was constantly full of noise and activity, and Grace could not have been happier. The ranch continued to prosper. Xander had a reputation in the territory for raising good cattle and dealing fairly with everyone. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters, rustlers and occasional conflicts with neighboring ranchers. Through it all, they had held on to the Double O, building it into something substantial and lasting. Grace had also made a place for herself in the community. She had become known as someone who could help with injuries and illnesses, and people would often ride out to the ranch seeking her assistance. She helped deliver several babies in the area, drawing on her own experiences and the knowledge Maria had passed on to her. She also started a small school on the ranch, teaching her own children and several children from neighboring ranches who had no other way to get an education. In the spring of 1895, Xander surprised Grace by taking her to Tucson for a week, leaving the children in Maria's capable care. It was the first time they had been alone together since before Tom was born, and Grace felt like a young bride again. They stayed in a real hotel with a proper bed and ate in restaurants and walked through the streets hand in hand like courting sweethearts. On their last night in Tucson, they went to a dance hall. Grace had not danced since leaving Boston, and she had forgotten how much she enjoyed it. Xander was not a natural dancer, but he tried gamely, spinning her around the floor while she laughed with delight. "You know what I was thinking about today," Xander said as they danced. "What? That map you bought, the one that nearly got you killed. I have been wondering whatever happened to that man who sold it to you." Grace shrugged. "I suppose he is still in Tucson, selling fake maps to other desperate people. Why? I looked for him while you were shopping this afternoon. Thought maybe I would have a few words with him about what he did." "Xander, that was 13 years ago. I know, but he almost killed you, Grace. He took your money and sent you to die in the desert." Grace stopped dancing and looked up at her husband. "If he had not done that, you never would have found me. We would never have met, never gotten married, never had our children. Maybe in some strange way I should thank him." Xander considered this. "I suppose when you put it that way," he said slowly. "But I still want to punch him in the face." Grace laughed. "Come on, let us go back to the hotel. This is our last night alone for who knows how long. Let us not waste it thinking about the past." They returned to the ranch the next day to a chaotic homecoming. All 4 children rushed to greet them, talking over each other in their excitement. Sam had a new frog he wanted to show them. Rose had written a story. Tom had helped birth a calf, and Kate just wanted to be held. Maria stood on the porch, smiling at the scene. "They missed you," she said when Grace finally made it up the steps with Kate in her arms. "I missed them too," Grace admitted. "Though it was wonderful to have some time alone with Xander. You two deserve it. You work so hard, both of you. It is good to remember why you do it." That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, Grace and Xander sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Grace leaned against her husband, feeling completely at peace. "Thank you for the trip," she said. "It was wonderful. We should do it more often, maybe once a year, just the 2 of us." "I would like that." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not found me that day?" "Sometimes. I suppose I would have kept running the ranch, maybe eventually married someone from Pierce or one of the other nearby towns. But it would not have been like this. It would not have been you." "I think about my life in Boston sometimes," Grace admitted. About what would have happened if I had married Charles Thornton. I would probably have children by now, but I would be miserable. I would be living in a big house in the city, going to parties and pretending to be happy, dying a little more inside every day. Do you ever regret leaving? Not for a single second. Even on the hardest days when the work is endless and I am so tired I can barely stand, I have never regretted it. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I wanted. Xander kissed the top of her head. I love you, Grace Oakes. I love you too. The years continued their steady march forward. Tom turned 18 in 1902 and announced his intention to start his own ranch on the western edge of the Double O property. Xander gave him 50 head of cattle and helped him build a small house, and Grace tried not to cry as she watched her eldest son ride out to begin his own life. But he was only a few miles away, and he came home for Sunday dinners, so it was not so bad. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman who caught the eye of a surveyor who came through the area in 1904. James Crawford was a good man from a good family, educated and kind, and when he asked permission to court Rose, both Grace and Xander gave their blessing. They were married in 1905, and Rose moved to Phoenix where James had taken a job with the territorial government. Grace cried at the wedding, holding tightly to Xander's hand. Our little girl, she whispered. She is happy, Xander said. That is what matters. Sam showed no interest in settling down. At 20, he was still bringing home stray animals and getting into scrapes. But he was also one of the best horsemen in the territory, and he started training horses for other ranches, earning a reputation for his skill and patience. Kate was 16 and already showing an interest in teaching. She had taken over the ranch school from Grace, teaching the younger children with a patience and creativity that reminded Grace of Rose. Grace suspected she would not stay on the ranch forever, but for now she was content, and that was enough. The Double O Ranch had grown substantially over the years. They now ran over 1,000 head of cattle and employed 8 full-time ranch hands. The original ranch house had been expanded twice, with new rooms added as the family grew. There was a proper schoolhouse now, and a larger barn and corrals that could hold dozens of horses. Xander's hair had started to gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there when Grace first met him. But to her, he was as handsome as ever. She had her own gray hairs now, and her hands were rougher, her face more weathered. But she did not mind. These were the marks of a life fully lived, of years spent doing meaningful work and loving deeply. In 1906, Arizona was moving closer to statehood, and there was excitement in the air about what that might mean for the territory. Grace and Xander attended town meetings in Pierce where the future was debated and planned. Grace found herself speaking up at these meetings, offering her opinions on education and infrastructure, and was surprised when people listened. You know what is funny? She told Xander one evening after one such meeting. In Boston, I never had opinions, or if I did, I kept them to myself because women were not supposed to speak up about such things. But here, no one seems to mind. That is the West, Xander said. Out here, if you have something worth saying, people listen, regardless of whether you are a man or a woman. You have earned respect in this community, Grace. People know you are smart and capable. Grace thought about this. It was true that the West had given her opportunities she never would have had in Boston. She had built a life here on her own terms, had raised children and run a business and become someone who mattered in her community. She had found herself in this harsh, beautiful land. In the winter of 1908, Maria fell ill. Grace cared for her as the older woman had once cared for Grace, sitting by her bedside and holding her hand. Maria had been part of their family for over 25 years, and Grace could not imagine the ranch without her. "Promise me something," Maria said one day when she was feeling a bit better. "Anything," Grace said. "Promise me you will tell your grandchildren about how you met Mr. Xander. Tell them about the girl who got lost in the desert and the cowboy who found her. Tell them about how love can be found in the most unlikely places." "I promise," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "But you will be here to tell them yourself." Maria smiled. "Perhaps, but just in case, promise me. I promise." Maria recovered from that illness, but she was never quite as strong afterward. She moved into the main house so Grace could care for her more easily, and she spent her days sitting on the porch, watching the ranch activity and telling stories to any of the grandchildren who came to visit. Tom married in 1909, a rancher's daughter named Anne who was as tough and capable as any man. They gave Grace and Xander their first grandchild in 1910, a boy named Jack. Grace held her grandson for the first time and thought about the circle of life, about how she had been lost and found, about how that had led to this new life in her arms. Sam finally settled down in 1911, marrying a schoolteacher from Pierce named Elizabeth. They built a house on the 00 property and started raising horses together, combining Sam's training skills with Elizabeth's business sense to create a thriving operation. On a warm evening in June 1912, the whole family gathered at the 00 to celebrate Xander's 50th birthday. Grace looked around at the crowded porch, at her children and their spouses, at her grandchildren running around the yard, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Tom was there with Anne and little Jack. Rose had come from Phoenix with James and their daughter, Sarah, named after Xander's sister. Sam and Elizabeth were expecting their first child. Kate had recently become engaged to a teacher she had met at a territorial education conference. After dinner, as the sun began to set, Xander stood up and called for everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words," he began. 27 years ago, I found a woman dying in the desert. I brought her back here, thinking I was just doing the right thing, helping someone who needed help. I had no idea that day would change my life forever. Grace, you have given me everything. A family, a home, a reason to work as hard as I do. You took this ranch and made it a place of love and laughter. You made me a better man. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Grace stood and walked to her husband, wrapping her arms around him while their family cheered. "You saved my life," she said softly, just for him. "And then you gave me a life worth living. I love you, Xander Oakes, now and forever." They kissed, and their grandchildren made exaggerated gagging noises, and everyone laughed. As the stars came out and the family talked and celebrated, Grace felt a deep sense of peace. She had been lost, so terribly lost, wandering in the desert with no idea where she was going. But Xander had found her, and he had made sure she would never be lost again, not just by bringing her to his ranch, but by giving her a place to belong, a purpose, a family. He had shown her who she could be, who she was meant to be. And she had done the same for him, helping him transform his ranch from just a place where he worked into a true home. The years continued to pass, marked by births and deaths, by good years and hard years, by all the small moments that make up a life. Grace and Xander grew old together, their hair turning white, their steps slowing. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by time and shared experiences. Maria passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1915, and they buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains in the distance. Grace stood by the grave and remembered the first time she had met Maria, how kind she had been to a stranger who had stumbled into their lives. She remembered all the things Maria had taught her, all the ways the older woman had helped her become who she was. In 1916, Xander had a health scare that left him weak for several months. Grace cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her all those years ago. She sat by his bedside and read to him, fed him when he was too weak to feed himself, held his hand when the pain was bad. He recovered eventually, but they both knew they were living on borrowed time now. They were in their late 50s, old by frontier standards, and every day was a gift. They spent more time on the porch now, content to watch the ranch activities rather than participate in them. Tom had taken over running the 00, though he still consulted with Xander on all major decisions. The ranch continued to thrive, now one of the most successful in the territory. On a cool evening in October 1918, Grace and Xander sat on their porch watching the sunset. It had become their favorite time of day, this quiet hour when the work was done and they could just be together. "You remember what you said to me the day we got married?" Xander asked suddenly. Grace thought back to that day so long ago. "I said a lot of things. Which part? You thanked me for making sure you would never be lost again. I remember, and I meant it. You did." Xander took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "I need you to know something. All these years I thought I was the one keeping you from being lost. But the truth is, you did the same for me. Before you came, I was just existing, working from sunup to sundown without any real purpose beyond survival. You gave me something to work for, something to build for. You were my compass, Grace. You kept me from being lost too." Grace felt tears in her eyes. After all these years, he could still move her with his words. "We saved each other then. We did. We absolutely did." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Grace thought about the scared young woman she had been, stumbling through the desert with no idea where she was going. She thought about the moment she had seen Xander riding toward her, the flood of relief and hope that had washed over her. She thought about every day since, every moment that had led them to this perfect evening. "I would do it all again," she said softly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every bit of it. I would do it all again to end up right here with you." "So would I," Xander agreed. "Every single second." The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had looked down on them that first night when Xander brought Grace to the ranch, when neither of them knew what the future would hold. Grace leaned her head on her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corrals, voices of ranch hands calling to each other as they finished the day's work. This was home. This was love. This was everything she had been searching for without knowing it, found in the most unexpected place and in the most unexpected way. Grace had arrived at the ranch lost, broken, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope for something better. Xander had saved her life that day, but more than that, he had given her a life. And together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. Their children would carry on the 00 ranch. Their grandchildren, and someday their great-grandchildren, would walk this land and hear stories about the woman who got lost in the desert and the cowboy who found her, who loved her, who made sure she would never be lost again. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they finally stood to go inside, arms around each other, moving slowly but together, as they always had been and always would be. The door closed behind them, and the porch light flickered out, leaving only the stars and the vast Arizona darkness, witness to a love story that had begun with a desperate woman and a compassionate man, and had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. Inside the house, Grace and Xander prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine they had performed thousands of times. As they lay down together, Grace curled against Xander's side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was the same position they had slept in for over 3 decades, a physical reminder of their connection, their partnership, their love. "Good night, my love," Xander murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Good night," Grace replied, already drifting off to sleep, safe and secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly who she was supposed to be with. She had been lost, but now she was found. And she would never, ever be lost again.